Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today's video is going to be the first of many videos coming out on our channel over the next few weeks as I make my way through the enormous United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I did not want to skip over or rush through anything, so I plan to visit this museum multiple times while we are living in D.C. and make sure I see it thoroughly and can do it justice on our channel. Today's video is part one of two videos filmed on the museum's third floor, which is the top floor, and we are covering an exhibit today called The Nazi Assault, 1933 through 1939. The second part of the third floor exhibit is called What Did Americans Know? And that video will be released on our channel immediately after this one. The Holocaust Memorial Museum is technically free to enter, but because it is so popular, you still have to get a timed entry ticket online as of summer 2025. There is a processing fee of $1 per ticket to reserve online. Also, because this is such a popular museum, especially with school and tour groups coming through, it was impossible for me to get great footage and great audio quality at the same time due to the noise of so many people in the background, including large groups of teenagers and kids. I've muted many clips and done voiceovers in those to explain what we are viewing without the background noise, but in some instances, muting the audio was just not an option. I apologize for the background noises, and I hope you enjoy the video as it is anyway. Let's get started. When you enter the Holocaust Museum, you are put on an elevator that takes you directly to the third floor to begin your tour, and that's where we are going to begin today, at the Nazi Assault 1933 through 1939 exhibit. I'm going to start by showing you the intro video that we all watched before we started looking at the exhibits. If you are not interested in watching this intro video, please skip ahead to the timestamp 16 minutes exactly. That's where the exhibits will start.
Summer 1933. Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Third Reich, was dictator of Germany. 15 years earlier, Adolf Hitler was a corporal in the German army, bitter, frustrated, and unknown. November 1918. World War I was over. The Imperial German army, once the most powerful in Europe, had been defeated. To many Germans, defeat meant humiliation, chaos, and confusion. For the war's end did not bring peace. It brought civil war. Though a democratic republic had been declared, left-wing revolutionaries attempted to seize power in several cities from Munich to Berlin. Militant right-wing units known as the Freikorps volunteered to battle with the leftists. By the spring of 1919, troops of the new Weimar Republic had taken control. Though there would be future attempts at revolution, for a time, order had been restored. Meanwhile, outside Paris at the Palace of Versailles, leaders of France, Great Britain, and the United States were meeting with delegates of the new German government to conclude a formal end to World War I. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to surrender significant territories and pay vast war debts. To many Germans, the treaty seemed motivated by revenge. Adolf Hitler believed Germany had been stabbed in the back, betrayed by revolutionaries, by Marxists and Jews. In the early 20s, many who shared these views were joining a new and militant party of the right, called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Among the first to join the Nazis was Adolf Hitler, who soon became the party's leader. A charismatic personality, he was able to articulate both popular frustration and a radical agenda for social change. In 1922, many Germans were standing in bread lines. Severe inflation had left the money worthless. Some even used it as wallpaper. Artist Kate Korwitz expressed her concern in simple human terms. Germany's children are starving. Soup kitchens were set up in cities across Germany. The economic crisis led to demonstrations. Communists were marching in the streets against the injustices of capitalism and against war. Krieg dem Kriege, war against war, read the signs which appeared at rallies by parties of the left. Death to Marxism, read the signs in Nazi demonstrations. They played on fears of future revolution. By 1923, the Nazi Party had more than 50,000 members. Emboldened by their growing strength, Hitler and his stormtroops launched a coup in Munich, hoping to start a revolution to overthrow the democratic Weimar government. The coup failed, but in the trial which followed, Hitler's outspoken defense enlarged his audience and made him a national figure. Though convicted of treason, he was given only a 5-year sentence. While in prison, Hitler wrote a book which would make him famous. It outlined his vision of Germany's future, a future without Jews and communists. Soon after his release, the book was published. It was called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. To the average German in 1925, Adolf Hitler's message had little appeal. Economic conditions had improved, and though Nazi stormtroops could be seen on the streets, especially during election campaigns, few Germans paid much attention to Hitler and his angry rantings. A nation yearning for stability and peace turned not to Hitler, but to Hindenburg. A legendary hero of the First World War, General Paul von Hindenburg was elected president in 1925. His promise to uphold the democratic constitution strengthened public confidence in the young German Republic. By the mid-20s, the future looked more promising. People could relax, as they did in Berlin's Kroll Gardens. Berlin was among the most cosmopolitan of cities. During the Weimar years, its writers, artists, and intellectuals created a culture of unparalleled vitality. The Nazis saw it as degenerate. To Germans frightened by the modern age and uncertain of the future, the Nazis offered refuge. Many were attracted by the party's emphasis on nationalism and strong authority. More than 15,000 marched through Nuremberg on Party Day in 1927. The Nazis borrowed the strong right-arm salute from Mussolini and the Italian fascists. It quickly became their own. The Nazis were well organized. District leaders were essential to the party's growth. So too was propaganda. The Völkischer Beobachter was the Nazi Party newspaper. After Hitler's abortive coup, the paper and the party were banned. By 1927, both were again legalized. To those who joined the stormtroops, the party provided an identity and an outlet for frustration. Brown shirts and swastikas were slowly spreading across Germany. The power of the growing Nazi party, however, would be determined by the votes of ordinary people, and it was to them that the Nazi message was principally addressed. In 1929, many Germans were again standing in bread lines and looking for work. The stock market collapse led to a worldwide economic depression. Once again, unemployment, hunger, and despair were fuel to the parties of both left and right. The parties of the left were weakened by division. German communists competed with socialists for the votes of the German working class. But their real enemies were the capitalists, the middle-class politicians, and the Nazis. The Social Democrats were the largest party in Germany. Despite their strength, they were incapable of sustained leadership. Their failure to unite the parties of the left was a weakness the Nazis would exploit. In the elections of the early 30s, the socialists condemned the Nazis as fascists. "Vote no," campaigned the socialists. For many Germans confused by the conflicts of an unsettled era, Nazi propaganda had great appeal. The message was simple and direct. The causes of Germany's problems were the communists, the Jews, and the hated Versailles Treaty. However ominous the message, it was delivered with a certainty that seemed to offer hope. Without effective coalitions between political parties, elected leaders could not govern. Election campaigns were frequent and violent. Gangs of Nazi thugs clashed with communists in the days before the Reichstag election of 1932. 99 people were killed in the streets. The government seemed incapable of action.
The German people desire nothing more than to live in peace in order to turn...
The German chancellor was a wealthy conservative, Franz von Papen. Like his predecessors, von Papen was an ineffective leader. The country was adrift. Without political consensus, the Reichstag had almost ceased to function by 1932. The government was now ruled not by laws, but by emergency decrees issued by the aging President Hindenburg. In the spring of 1932, Hitler announced that he would run for president against Hindenburg. Hitler campaigned extensively, repeating the Nazi message, "Germany, awake! Hitler is your last hope." When neither Hitler nor Hindenburg won a clear majority, a runoff election was announced. The Nazis called the second campaign Hitler over Germany. With only a week to campaign, the Nazis chartered a plane from Lufthansa to carry Hitler from one election rally to the next. President Hindenburg made one radio address. Hitler spoke to rallies in 21 cities. The aerial campaign created a sensation. To audiences hungering for leadership, Hitler's promises of bread and work and a Germany restored to greatness were persuasive.
14 Jahre lang haben diese Parteien die deutsche Freiheit vergewaltigt, mit deutschen Menschen geknebelt und geschlagen. 2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir das Land!
Hitler was defeated in the runoff election, but his power and popularity continued to increase, especially after the Reichstag election in the summer of 1932. Again, no party won an absolute majority, but the Nazis now held more than a third of the seats. For the first time, the Nazi delegates outnumbered those of any other party, left or right. The Nazi victories in the Reichstag elections made it even more difficult for Chancellor von Papen to govern. Hindenburg disliked Hitler, but within months the aging president was persuaded that political stability required naming the Nazi leader chancellor. His advisors assured him that Hitler could be controlled. At the end of January 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler, the former army corporal, Chancellor of Germany. The news of Hitler's appointment led to celebrations in cities across Germany. In Berlin, Nazi stormtroops held a torchlight parade through the streets. Hitler watched in triumph from the windows of the Chancellor. Von Papen remained vice-chancellor in the new cabinet, but Hitler would soon maneuver to eliminate all but Nazis from this coalition government. those who argued that Hitler would become more moderate once in power were wrong.
Deutschland ist nun erwacht. Die Macht haben wir nun in Deutschland gewonnen. Nun gilt es, das deutsche Volk zu gewinnen.
Germany has awakened, Hitler proclaimed. We have won power. Now we must win the people. Within weeks, all opposition parties were banned, their leaders imprisoned. And Hitler launched a brutal campaign of terror to consolidate his power. By the summer of 1933, Adolf Hitler was master of Germany.
American troops discovered the charred remains of prisoners when they liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp in central Germany in April of 1945. Here we are watching footage done by Lieutenant Colonel George Stevens as he entered the Dachau concentration camp in early May of 1945, just days after its liberation. Stevens and his men shot this film as a record of what they encountered. One of America's leading film directors, Stevens went on after the war to direct The Diary of Anne Frank and other films. After liberation, a U.S. Army photographer took this picture of a starved concentration camp inmate. Men stand and sit in an infirmary at the Ebensee, Austria camp after its liberation by U.S. forces May 8 of 1945. Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George Patton view the corpses of concentration camp prisoners in Germany, April 12, 1945. Eisenhower said, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Now we are looking at what led up to these events before the Holocaust. In 1933, more than 9 million Jews lived in continental Europe. Within less than a decade, most of these countries in which they lived would be invaded, occupied, or annexed by Nazi Germany. Within a dozen years, 2 out of 3 European Jews would be dead, and European Jewish life changed forever. Jews had lived in Europe for almost 2,000 years. Depending on where they lived and when, they experienced persecution and isolation, or prosperity and social acceptance. By the 19th century, Jewish life embraced both the assimilated Jews of Western Europe and the Orthodox, relatively segregated Jews of Eastern Europe. There, Yiddish was the dominant language of the Jews, and traditional religious observance the norm. By the 1880s, Jewish life was in ferment throughout Europe. Though Western Jews had gained equal rights under the law, religious anti-Semitism reappeared with political and racial overtones. In Eastern Europe, Jews faced poverty, anti-Semitism, and periodically outbreaks of mass violence known as pogroms. Yet, Jewish traditions and culture remained full of vitality, and Jewish religious life was rich and fervently observed. Jewish artists, writers, scholars, and scientists thrived and contributed greatly to their fields of endeavor. Democracy in Germany was increasingly at risk during the 1920s and early 1930s. Many Germans blamed the new Weimar Republic for the unpopular Versailles Treaty, which had ended World War I. Dissatisfaction with the parliamentary system grew as rising unemployment and hunger caused by the worldwide economic depression made everyday life miserable for most Germans. As liberal political parties lost popularity, anti-democratic forces gained ground. After 1930, it became impossible to form a majority coalition in the German parliament. Chancellors were appointed by the president, and they ruled by decrees allowed under the Constitution. Adolf Hitler rose to power in the midst of this economic and political turmoil. In the 1920s, his National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as the NSDAP or the Nazi Party, was widely discounted as a radical fringe group. But by 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest political organization in Germany, although it had failed to gain a majority. The German president, Paul von Hindenburg, was advised to form a coalition government embracing the Nazi and other right-wing nationalist parties. He became persuaded that in such a coalition, Hitler could be controlled. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. Hitler assumed power under a guise of lawfulness that concealed his true intentions. Conservative politicians underestimated him. Left-wing politicians were equally naive. Neither took Hitler seriously until it was too late. At first, the new government included only 3 Nazis, Hitler as chancellor, and Hermann Göring and Wilhelm Frick as ministerial posts. Once in power, they quickly laid the legal foundations for a Nazi dictatorship. On February 27, 1933, a fire destroyed parts of the German parliament building, the Reichstag. Hitler immediately accused the Communists, an opposition party, of setting the blaze, and he issued an emergency decree that allowed him to crush the political opposition. This decree became the basis of the Nazi police state and would remain in effect until 1945. On March 23rd, a Nazi-dominated parliament voted to transfer all legislative powers to Hitler's cabinet. After this enabling act, the parliament would serve merely as a rubber stamp. Finally, all political organizations except the Nazi Party were banned on July 14th. The one-party state was thus established within 6 months of Hitler's appointment as chancellor. Violence and brutality were fundamental elements of Hitler's dictatorship. They were used to prevent any militant opposition to the new government and to remove existing barriers on its path to total control. Hitler had long relied on the use of terror. His main tool was the Nazi Party's paramilitary organization, the SA. In thousands of demonstrations and brawls, these brown-shirted stormtroopers agitated for Nazi goals with beatings and bloodshed. By 1933, SA membership had swelled to 450,000, dwarfing the German army. When Hitler became chancellor, he inaugurated his regime with a rash of SA violence against his political opponents. Street battles on Bloody Sunday, which was February 12, 1933, left 1 communist dead and hundreds wounded. About 2 weeks later, on the night of the Reichstag fire, 4,000 communists and social democrats were arrested. In June, during the Week of Blood, Nazi thugs killed 91 communists in Berlin alone. Almost immediately after the takeover of power, Hitler's second-in-command, Hermann Göring, gave shoot-to-kill orders to police sent to quell communist demonstrators. On February 22, 1933, Göring enrolled Nazi stormtroopers and members of the SS, the elite guard of the Nazi Party, as auxiliary police. In April, Göring established the most notorious tool of state violence, the Gestapo. Simultaneously, Nazi Party officials and SA leaders set up dozens of makeshift concentration camps all over Germany. These so-called wild camps were sites of great cruelty. By the end of July 1933, Almost 27,000 people, virtually all of them political prisoners, were incarcerated in wild camps. On March 22, 1933, less than 2 months after Hitler became Chancellor, the SS chief Heinrich Himmler founded Dachau, the first SS-operated concentration camp. It was the precursor of a vast system of camps. At 10 o'clock a.m. on April 1, 1933, the Nazis staged a massive nationwide boycott against Jewish businesses and professional offices. In cities, towns, and villages throughout Germany, stormtroopers and SS men blocked entrances to Jewish shops. The Star of David had been painted in yellow and black across thousands of shop doors and windows. Signs read, "Germans, defend yourselves. Don't buy from the Jews are our misfortunes," and sometimes just simply read Jew. In the first 60 days of the Nazi regime, anti-Semitic violence had been directed against individuals. The boycott was the first public nationwide attack by the Nazi Party against an entire German Jewish community. The decision to boycott was Hitler's. As reports of violence against German Jews and Jewish businesses increased, foreign protest intensified. There was talk of an American boycott of German goods. Hitler intended the boycott as an act of revenge against foreign criticisms of his regime. Certain Nazi leaders, such as the newspaper editor Julius Streicher, wanted a permanent and total boycott. But President Hindenburg and the foreign minister Konstantin von Neurath convinced Hitler that the economic damage of a permanent boycott would be too great. Hitler decided to limit the boycott to 1 day. On March 26th, he instructed his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, "We must proceed to a large-scale boycott of Jewish businesses in Germany. Perhaps the foreign Jews will think better of the matter when their racial comrades in Germany begin to get it in the neck." The police were instructed not to hinder the boycott in any way and to intervene only where there was a threat to life or property. Public reactions were mixed. In many places, spontaneous violence erupted against the Jews. Some Germans, however, made it a point of honor to enter Jewish shops or to call on Jewish friends. In the spring of 1933, party officials and members of the Nazi student organization raided libraries and bookstores in 30 cities and towns across Germany. They removed truckloads of books and cast them onto bonfires. On May 10th, more than 25,000 books were burned in Berlin alone. The book burnings were not spontaneous. They were a calculated, coordinated effort to purify German culture. The students worked from prepared blacklists of books deemed un-German. Some of these books were by Jewish authors, but most were not. The spectacle of the burnings included torchlight parades, fervid speeches, and towering bonfires. In Frankfurt, books were brought into the pyre in ox-drawn manure carts as Chopin's funeral march played in the background. At the Opera House, opposite the main entrance to Berlin University, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels triumphantly proclaimed, "The age of a hair-splitting Jewish intellectualism is dead. The past lies in the flames." Among the Jewish writers whose books were burned in the spring of 1933 were Franz Werfel, Stefan Zweig, and Max Brod, the physicist Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. The many non-Jewish authors whose works were thrown into the flames included the novelists Erich Maria Remarque and Heinrich Mann, and the playwright Bertolt Brecht. Works by the communist theorists Marx, Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and Rosa Luxemburg were burned, as were Magnus Hirschfeld's writings on homosexuality. Also incinerated were books by non-Jewish American novelists Jack London, Sinclair Lewis, Theodore Dreiser, Ernest Hemingway, and John Dos Passos. Writings by the American women's rights activist Margaret Sanger were destroyed, as were those by Helen Keller. Keller reacted to the book burnings with defiant authority, saying, "Tyranny cannot defeat the power of ideas." The Nazis used propaganda, along with terror, to manipulate the German population. In the hands of Hitler's Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda was simplistic, emotional, repetitive, and uncompromising. Propaganda indoctrinated Germans in the basic principles of Nazi theology. Among these was the leader principle, which promoted Hitler as the ultimate source of power and justice. Slogans such as "One People, One Reich, One Leader" helped catalyze the public's perception of Hitler as a national savior. Individuals were urged to sacrifice themselves for a greater people's community. Even elementary schools became forums of political indoctrination and racial hatred. Nazi propaganda taught Germans to think in racist terms. Political reliability was measured by a person's adherence to racist ideas, especially anti-Semitism. These messages helped to realize another aim of propaganda: the public's total obedience to the unlimited power of the regime. Nazi propaganda drew its power from the government's absolute control over the flow of information. All news media was censored by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Freedom of speech was ruthlessly suppressed. Beginning on September 1, 1939, Germans who listened to uncensored information on foreign radio broadcasts risked severe punishment. Endless rallies, parades, speeches, rituals, and sham elections were tools of public persuasion. Every year, Germans were expected to participate in hundreds of Nazi events. Such ceremonies reinforced Nazi ideology among the faithful and helped to weed out the disobedient. Goebbels also exploited the latest techniques of film and radio to communicate Nazi achievements. The government made inexpensive radios available to every German household. In his book, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler had stated that it was the mission of the German Reich to assemble and preserve the German people's most valuable racial elements and raise them to a dominant position. All human beings were grouped into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. The Nazis regarded Germans and other Nordic people as racially superior, and Slavs, Roma Gypsies, and blacks as inferior. At the bottom of this scale were the Jews, considered also to be the most dangerous race, in part because, in the Nazis' view, Jews lived parasitically off of other races and weakened them. Nazism taught the racial struggle was the driving force in history. Superior races must prevail over inferior races in order not to be corrupted by them. Superior races must be encouraged to reproduce, but procreation by inferior races should be discouraged. Racism pervaded the culture of Nazi Germany. Racist ideas were taught in schools and penetrated the fields of anthropology, sociology, biology, and medicine. During World War II, racism shaped Nazi Germany's social policies and war aims and charted the course towards genocide. Hitler transformed Nazi racism from a political philosophy into a concrete public policy. As part of an overall effort to purify the German population, a program of forced sterilization was announced on July 14, 1933. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring required that certain categories of persons be sterilized. Anyone suffering from congenital feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia or manic depression, epilepsy, Huntington's disease, congenital blindness or deafness, a physical deformity, or severe alcoholism. So-called genetic health courts administered this program. The sterilizations began in January 1934. Within a decade, between 250 and 300,000 people, most of them Germans, had been forcibly sterilized. Only the Roman Catholic Church opposed this program consistently. German Protestant churches accepted it and often cooperated with it. Nazi Germany was not the first or only country to sterilize people considered abnormal. Before Hitler, the United States had led the world in policies of compulsory sterilization, but no nation carried sterilization as far as Nazi Germany did. In Germany, forced sterilization ultimately led to a euthanasia program, the systemic murder of the physically and mentally handicapped. The exclusion of Jews from German society was gradual but unrelenting. Between 1933 and 1939, the Nazis enacted over 400 laws to define, segregate, and impoverish German Jews. Nazi anti-Jewish policies were first directed against state employees, but they soon broadened in scope. On April 7, 1933, Jewish civil servants were dismissed from their jobs. By the end of that year, Jewish editors had been ousted and Jewish writers expelled from the Writers' Guilds. By 1934, Jewish students and professors were being excluded from higher education. In 1935, the regime moved to define Jews racially and to deprive them of German citizenship and civil rights. The next step was to destroy Jews economically. The Nazis began closing down the remaining Jewish businesses in April of 1938. In a process called Aryanization, Jewish businessmen were forced to sell out to Germans, usually at below-market prices. Within a year, 4 out of every 5 Jewish businesses had been transferred to Aryan ownership. Jews in Germany were traumatized by the victory of Nazism. Some committed suicide and many left Germany. Those who remained were polarized between the Zionists, who sought Jewish immigration to Palestine, and a larger group that vigorously affirmed Jewish ties to the German state, society, culture, and language. German Jews struggled to preserve their rights, and they hoped that the state would protect them. In 1933, the Jewish community announced, "We may expect that the German-Jewish question will be solved on a legal basis and that there will be created an honest understanding of our place and way." Such affirmations were in vain. Banished from German society, many Jews returned to their Jewish roots. Synagogue attendance increased dramatically, and Jewish education and cultural life intensified. Martin Buber, a widely respected Jewish theologian, established a network of centers for adult education. Jewish theological seminaries introduced full university curricula for students excluded from German universities, and Jewish schools were opened for pupils at risk in German classrooms. The Jewish press increased in size and importance. Jewish artists and musicians who had been expelled from German theaters and orchestras were supported by the Kulturbund, the Cultural Society of German Jews. The Jewish community gained vitality even as its circumstances grew more desperate. Because of the Nazi persecution, Zionism became the dominant political trend among German Jews. By 1939, immigration to Palestine had become the major objective of the Jewish community. Adolf Hitler was determined to increase the territory of Germany by any means available. Until 1939, he was able to do this without a fight. Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland, the part of Germany west of the Rhine, was his first aggressive act. On March 7, 1936, he sent German troops there in an open violation of the Versailles Treaty, which had ended World War I. German troops next marched into Austria on March 12, 1938, welcomed by most of its inhabitants. Austria was incorporated into Germany the following day. A rigged plebiscite in April gave 99.7% Austrian approval to the annexation known as Anschluss. Hitler then threatened war unless Czechoslovakia ceded Sudetenland, a border area inhabited by an ethnic German majority. On September 29, 1938, he convened a conference of European leaders in Munich to resolve the crisis he had provoked. Czechoslovakia was not represented. Believing that giving in to Hitler's demands might prevent war, the leaders of Great Britain, France, and Italy allowed Germany to annex Sudetenland. On his return to England, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain boasted of having achieved peace for our time. But within 6 months, German troops would occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain would be blamed for bringing Europe closer to war. The Anschluss was disastrous for the Austrian Jews. When Germany incorporated Austria in March of 1938, about 185,000 Jews lived there, 90% of them in Vienna. The Nazi authorities in Austria immediately initiated a program of anti-Jewish persecution. At first, Jews were attacked and humiliated on Vienna's streets. Next, Jewish businesses were taken over by non-Jews or were closed down. Austrian Jews were then removed from their homes to segregated dwellings called Jewish houses or were pressured to emigrate. In charge of the emigration was Adolf Eichmann, an SS captain. By the summer of 1939, 21,000 Jewish businesses had been closed and 5,000 taken over. By the outbreak of the war, 75% of the Austrian Jews had left the country. On September 15, 1935, at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, the German parliament enacted 2 new laws that became the centerpiece of Nazi anti-Jewish legislation. Under the Reich citizenship law, only persons of German or kindred blood could claim the new status of Reich citizenship. German Jews remained merely subjects of the state. The law for the protection of German blood and honor banned marriage and sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood as crimes of racial defilement. It also forbade Jews to employ female German house servants under the age of 45. For the first time in history, Jews were subject to persecution not for their religious identity or practices, but solely for their Jewish birth. All persons who were born Jewish were defined as Jews, even if their parents had converted to Christianity. The Nuremberg laws reversed emancipation, a process begun over a century before, by which German Jews had achieved full rights of citizenship in the land of their birth. With the passage of the Nuremberg laws, the German nation was divided into Aryans and Jews. Yet the term Jew remained unidentified. Since the laws included measures for criminal prosecution, the need for a clear definition was urgent. By November 14, 1935, the term Jew embraced 2 categories. A full Jew was defined as any person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents and certain persons with 2 Jewish grandparents. A part Jew was considered not a Jew, but a person of mixed Jewish blood. The part Jew category was later further defined as a first or second degree. A first degree was a half Jew, any person with 2 Jewish grandparents who did not practice Judaism and was not married to a Jew, and a second degree was a quarter Jew who had only 1 Jewish grandparent. German society was now divided according to Nazi racial theories. There were Aryans and there were non-Aryans.
Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis killed about 6 million Jews and millions of other civilians throughout Europe. These are some who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. A generation lost forever. Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible who lived in a land now known as Israel. They believe that there is only one God. Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew who preached a singular religious message. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the customs and religious rituals of Judaism. The Last Supper was a Jewish religious meal, probably at Passover. Jesus was put to death at the hands of Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate in Judea, but the gospel accounts were interpreted as blaming all Jews for the crucifixion. To his followers, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. His death, sacrificial atonement. Most Jews believed the Messiah had not yet come. Redemption was not at hand. Soon after the crucifixion, Roman armies destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Jews were exiled and scattered to live as a dispersed minority. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. The early Christian church portrayed Jews as unwilling to accept the word of God. Illuminations showed Satan binding the eyes of the Jews. Some church leaders intensified the charge, condemning Jews as agents of the devil and murderers of God. The accusation was not renounced until the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council officially repudiated the ancient charge that Jews had murdered Christ. For centuries, state and church laws restricted Jews, preventing them from owning land and holding public office. Guilds excluded Jews from most occupations, forcing them into pursuits like moneylending, trade, commerce. Excluded from Christian society, Jews maintained their religious and social customs. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. On the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians persecuted Jews. Portrayed as alien, Jews were regarded as usurers. It was said Jews poisoned the wells of Europe, causing the Black Plague. Illustrations depicted Jews as the devil, with horns and cloven feet, and showed them using the blood of Christian children in ritual sacrifices. These lies came to be taken as truth. But where they were needed, Jews were tolerated. When they were allowed to participate in the larger society, Jews thrived. In many places, secular and religious states forced Jews into segregated districts later called ghettos. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and many German states expelled masses of Jews, most of whom migrated eastward, taking with them their religious convictions and traditions. In 1517, Martin Luther attacked the Pope and corruption within his own Roman Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. The young Luther hoped that tolerance would persuade Jews to convert. But when Jews adhered to their own religious beliefs and refused to join his new Reformed Church, Luther's disappointment turned to hatred. What then shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Their synagogues should be set on fire, and what does not burn must be covered over with earth, so that no man will ever see stone or cinder of them again. Their houses also should be razed and destroyed. All their prayer books should be taken from them. The Protestant Reformation brought no end to the anti-Jewish tradition of Christianity. With the 18th century Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, the domination of the church diminished. Some Enlightenment thinkers called for full rights for Jews, but only on the condition that they discard their religious customs. Others blamed Judaism as the source of irrational religious faith. Even though many Jews assimilated socially and culturally, prejudice did not disappear. In France in 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, the only Jewish member of the French Army's General Staff, was convicted of passing military secrets to Germany. Later, proof of forgery confirmed his innocence, but Dreyfus remained the victim of a cover-up to divert attention from Army corruption. A century after the French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, giving Jews their freedom, frenzied mobs in the streets of Paris chanted, "Death to the Jews." Religious discrimination had gradually changed into a thriving secular, political, and social anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, freed from some restrictions, many Jews entered the Christian world and became prominent citizens. Then, around 1900, a new lie was promoted, that Jews conspired to dominate the world using their money and intelligence to manipulate trusting Christians. Russian secret police forged a document to support the story of a takeover plot supposedly authored by a conference of Jewish leaders. A proven forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was nevertheless translated into every major language and distributed worldwide. It is circulated even today, despite indisputable proof that it is a fake. To divert popular discontent at appalling living conditions and autocratic control, Russian authorities encouraged anti-Semitic violence. Jews were blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Pogroms, murderous rampages against Jews, erupted in Russia many times during the next 3 decades. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of yet another kind of anti-Semitism. At its core was the theory that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a separate race, Semites, set apart because of genetically inherited characteristics. Anti-Semites believed racial characteristics could not be overcome by assimilation or even conversion. Jews were said to be dangerous and threatening because of their, quote, Jewish blood. Anti-Semitic racism united pseudo-scientific theories with centuries-old anti-Jewish stereotypes. These ideas gained wide acceptance. The devastation of World War I, the demeaning Peace of Versailles, the hyperinflation of the 1920s and the Depression of 1929 fueled mass discontent. The presence of Jews in German cultural, economic, and political life made them convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortunes. Enter Adolf Hitler. Hitler viewed world history as a racial struggle for survival of the fittest. He saw Jews as the source of all evil, disease, social injustice, cultural decline, capitalism, and all forms of Marxism, especially communism. Anti-Semitism would become the predominant ideology of the Third Reich.
Einen Kampfziel erhoben, endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben
Nazi racism victimized many groups of people, but it was against the Jews that the Nazi state mobilized all its resources for terror. After the Nazi takeover of power, anti-Jewish measures were put into effect one after another. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jews were defined, separated from non-Jews. Jews were excluded from professions and studies. Jewish children were barred from schools. Jews were subjected to public humiliation. The changes, whether gradual or sudden, were incomprehensible. Few could imagine what would happen, even Jews. The Nazis took anti-Semitism to an unprecedented level of violence. Genocide, the systematic murder of millions of people deemed inferior. Six million Jews. These are some of them.
After Germany annexed Austria in March of 1938, pressure mounted on President Franklin D. Roosevelt to respond to the intensified refugee crisis in Europe. Roosevelt proposed an international conference. 33 nations were invited and reassured that no country will be expected to receive a greater number of immigrants than is permitted by existing legislation. The invitation further pointed out that refugee assistance programs would be financed by private agencies and emphasized that no government funds would be required. In addition, Great Britain was assured that the subject of Jewish immigration into Palestine would not be discussed. 2 days after Roosevelt announced the Evian Conference, Adolf Hitler remarked, "I can only hope that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals," by criminals he meant Jews, "will at least be generous enough to convert the sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries, for all I care, even on luxury ships." But the United States did not intend to increase its own immigration quotas. American representation at Evian was played down. Neither the Secretary of State nor the Undersecretary attended the conference. Little was expected, and even less was accomplished. From July 6 through 15, 1938, delegations from 32 nations met at Evian, France, to identify refugee havens for German and Austrian Jews. Country after country acknowledged the refugee plight, yet offered little more than excuses. Great Britain would admit few Jews and kept Palestine closed to large-scale Jewish immigration. Canada was willing to accept farmers, but this did not help the urban Jews of Austria and Germany. Australia declined to assist because it, quote, "did not have a racial problem and is not desirous of importing one." The Venezuelan delegate was reluctant to disturb the demographic equilibrium of his country. No Jewish merchants, peddlers, or intellectuals were wanted there. The Netherlands and Denmark offered only temporary asylum. The United States finally agreed to admit for the first time the full legal quota for immigrants from Germany and Austria. The Dominican Republic alone offered to receive a substantial number of 100,000 Jews. On the night of November 9, 1938, the Nazi regime orchestrated an outbreak of anti-Jewish violence throughout Germany, which by then included Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia. During the pogroms, more than 1,000 synagogues were set on fire and over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, many hospitals, schools, and homes were also damaged. More than 25,000 Jews were arrested without cause and sent to concentration camps. At least 91 Jews were killed. The pogroms were given the name Kristallnacht, which means Night of Broken Glass, after the shattered shop windows of Jewish-owned stores that littered the streets when the violence ended. Stormtroopers, SS men, and Hitler Youth members caused most of the destruction. The Nazis portrayed the riots as a spontaneous outburst of public rage provoked by the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish student named Herschel Ginspan. Ginspan's parents, along with thousands of other Polish Jews living in Germany, had been abruptly deported to the Polish border. In reality, the pogroms had only been organized at the last minute by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and other high officials. In the wake of the November pogroms, the Nazis imposed a penalty equal to $400 million on the entire German Jewish community. Jews were held liable for the repair of their damaged homes, shops, and synagogues. The government also confiscated all the insurance payments owed to the Jewish victims of the destruction. Meanwhile, the Nazis filled the concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen with thousands of Jewish inmates. The SS released them only if they agreed to immigrate quickly. The Night of Broken Glass marked a turning point in the Nazi persecution of Jews. A series of new anti-Jewish decrees ensued from a conference held by Hitler's second-in-command, Hermann Göring, on November 12, 1938, several days after the pogroms. They resulted in the complete isolation of Jews in Germany. The focal point in every synagogue is the Torah. These fragments are from Torahs damaged in Marburg and Vienna synagogues on Kristallnacht. In the Vienna synagogue, Nazis cut up the Torah and threw pieces into the street. During the 1930s, the Nazis singled out various groups for persecution. Jews became their main target, but hundreds of thousands of others were oppressed as enemies of the state. Communists, social democrats, trade unionists, liberals, and pacifists were arrested for their political views or activities. Dissenting clergy faced imprisonment if they spoke out against the regime, while Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted for their refusal to swear allegiance to the state. Others were oppressed because the Nazis viewed them as sources of social, racial, or biological degeneration. Homosexuals were targeted because of their sexual orientation. Roma gypsies and, after 1939, Czechs, Poles, and Slavic peoples from the Soviet Union were stigmatized as racially inferior and deemed threats to the German nation. The Nazis regarded mentally and physically disabled persons as lives unworthy of life. The Nazi regime characterized almost any act of opposition as a political crime. Until the Night of Broken Glass, most victims of political persecution were communists and social democrats. Wave after wave of mass arrests, trials, and executions effectively disrupted these parties. By 1938, the regime had crushed virtually all organized opposition, although some communists and social democrats continued to operate underground. Nazi persecution of political opponents exacted a terrible price in human suffering. Between 1933 and 1939, the criminal courts sentenced tens of thousands of Germans for political crimes. On the eve of the war, concentration camps held about 25,000 inmates, most of them political prisoners. As part of their attempt to purify German society and propagate a master race, the Nazis condemned homosexual men and lesbians as socially aberrant. Soon after taking office, Hitler banned all homosexual and lesbian organizations. Meanwhile, stormtroopers raided the institutions and gathering places of these homosexual and lesbian communities. In 1934, the SS chief Heinrich Himmler created a special police bureaucracy to combat male homosexuality. As early as December of that year, homosexual men were subjected to systemic criminal prosecution. Many of them were imprisoned in concentration camps. Their uniforms sometimes bore an identifying mark, such as a black dot, and later this was replaced by a pink triangle. The vast majority of homosexual victims were males. Lesbians were persecuted to a far lesser extent. Nazi harassment of Jehovah's Witnesses began in 1933. Because they refused military service and would not swear allegiance to the regime, witnesses were often accused of espionage and conspiracy against the state. The Nazis interpreted the witnesses' predictions of future anarchy as revolutionary threats, and their prophecies about the return of Jews to Palestine as Zionist statements. Nevertheless, the witnesses continued to meet, preach, and distribute literature. They lost their jobs, pensions, and all civil rights, and beginning in 1937, they were sent to concentration camps. There, the Nazis designated them as voluntary prisoners. Jehovah's Witnesses who renounced their beliefs could be freed, but not a single one of them recanted. Freemasons were also considered ideological foes by the Nazis. In 1935, all Masonic lodges were abolished. Like the Jews, the Freemasons were dismissed from civil service. During the Night of Broken Glass, SA men were encouraged to print anti-Masonic slogans on damaged shops and synagogues. Beginning in 1938, the persecution slackened. In April of that year, Hitler declared a partial amnesty for Freemasons, and in September, low-ranking Freemasons were readmitted to the civil service. Nevertheless, harassment of Freemasons who remained active continued, and obstinate Freemasons were imprisoned in concentration camps. This wagon belonged to semi-nomadic Roma gypsies who lived in Czechoslovakia and engaged in horse trading. After 1933, Roma and Sinti gypsies were often forcibly relocated by Nazi officials to detention camps on the outskirts of cities and housed in wagons or barracks. As Germany expanded through annexations and war, this policy was applied in Austria, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in occupied Czechoslovakia, and in other territories. The photo mural shows the police-ordered resettling of Roma and Sinti from the Vienna suburb of Semmering. The Reinhardt and Winterstein families were among the Sinti and Roma gypsies persecuted by the Nazi regime. In 1936, the criminal police began registering all gypsies, including Gabriel Reinhardt, who was subsequently classified as a full-blooded gypsy. Several years later, his family's gypsy orchestra was banned from performing. In 1942, Gabriel and his fiancée Theresia Winterstein had to apply for special permission to get married, which was granted under the condition that she be sterilized. Pregnant with twins, Theresia agreed to this stipulation. The infants, Rolanda and Rita, were taken away for scientific studies to the Würzburg University Clinic, where Rolanda died and Theresia was sterilized. In 1944, other members of the two families were deported to the Auschwitz Killing Center. In Nazi Germany, power was centralized in one person, Adolf Hitler. The Hitler dictatorship demanded the public's unconditional obedience, and it tolerated no criticism or dissent. Organizations refusing to conform with Nazi ideology were destroyed. Most German organizations were quickly placed under Nazi control. Belonging to them was advisable if not compulsory. Farmers were forcibly united in the nationwide Association of Reich Food Producers. Labor unions were replaced by the German Labor Front. In 1934, acting in accordance with the Nazi leader principle, soldiers in the German army swore allegiance not to the Constitution or the state, but to Hitler himself. Even the Christian churches fell under Nazi influence, and many Protestant and Roman Catholic officials openly supported the regime. Only the dissident Protestant confessing church declared the unquestioning obedience to the state was not compatible with Christian faith. From childhood, every stage of a German's life was dominated by the Nazi state. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls prepared young people for lifelong service to the party. Tours of duty in the Reich Labor Service and the Army were obligatory for men. Women were expected to bear pure Aryan children as a service to Nazi society, and mothers were given awards according to the number of children that they bore. This banner once flew over Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. In 1920, at Hitler's urging, the Nazi Party adopted the swastika as its official symbol. A law passed on September 15th of 1935, the same date as the Nuremberg Laws, declaring the Nazi banner to be the national flag of Germany. From the beginning of Hitler's dictatorship, Germans understood that dissent placed them in serious danger. At first, Hitler relied on the Nazi Party's private army, the SA, to intimidate the population through public acts of violence. In mid-1934, the SA lost its position of predominance to the elite SS led by Heinrich Himmler. As the SS took control over all police forces and most concentration camps in Germany, the SA's strong-arm tactics gave way to a subtler but more deadly machinery of intimidation. Himmler's main instrument of terror was the secret state police called the Gestapo. It alone had the power to impose protective custody, a euphemism for arrest without warrant. Himmler's subordinate Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of security police, operated with almost unlimited authority. The Gestapo's power outweighed its actual size. Through the use of secret beatings, torture, and murder, its agents maintained a climate of fear, hatred, and suspicion. The Gestapo gathered much of its information from private citizens. Waiters denounced restaurant patrons, bosses denounced workers, and even children were taught to report on their parents. The Gestapo's main sources, however, were Nazi Party officials and SA men who constantly monitored the activity of citizens. A prime Nazi objective was to make Germany Judenrein, cleansed of all Jews. During the 1930s, the regime officially encouraged Jews to immigrate. Many German Jews wanted to leave, but they had to find a haven and then pay a punitive flight tax. First to immigrate were those Jews at greatest risk: politicians, professionals, and intellectuals, along with their families. Between 1933 and 1938, about 169,000 Jews left Germany, 30% of the number living there in 1933. After the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, many more sought to immigrate. By 1939, the number of havens available to Jewish refugees had become smaller. Switzerland feared being inundated by German Jews, and the British government continued to restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine. Eventually, Latin American countries took in about 39,600 refugees. Only the Japanese-controlled city of Shanghai in China did not require visas or certificates of good conduct from Jewish immigrants, and about 15,000 Jews found refuge there. By 1940, viable escape routes were closed, and Jews deemed capable of aiding the Allied war effort were barred from leaving. Immigration from Nazi Germany had become virtually impossible, and in October of 1941, it was officially forbidden. Between 1933 and 1938, About 40,000 German Jews found sanctuary in America, a fraction of those who sought to enter. The United States could have absorbed many more but did not. Bound by immigration quotas, influenced by popular anti-immigrant sentiment, and hampered by anti-Semitism at the State Department, the United States government remained callous in its unwillingness to help. A strict quota system limited the immigration of German and Austrian nationals, and to obtain visas, refugees had to undergo a bewildering and often capricious bureaucratic process. Many German and Austrian Jews were prevented from qualifying for visas until 1938, the only year when the quota was filled. Neither the White House nor Congress was willing to increase the quota. Efforts to rescue Jewish children failed as well. The Wagner-Rogers Bill, which proposed the admission of 20,000 refugee children on an emergency basis, died on the Senate floor in 1939. Jewish leaders in America were deeply concerned about the dangers faced by German and Austrian Jews, but American Jewry, composed of disunited political factions, was unable to alter the United States immigration policy. In August of 1938, SS officer Adolf Eichmann established the Central Office for Jewish Immigration in Vienna to pressure Austrian Jews to leave their homeland. Within months, tens of thousands of Jews had fled or emigrated. Eichmann's office became a model for those set up in Berlin and Prague. This chart, titled Jewish Migration from the Ostmark, which was German-annexed Austria, and prepared for Eichmann by the Vienna Jewish community, details the destruction between May 2nd of 1938 and March 31st of 1941 of this centuries-old community in Austria. As of March 31, 1941, only 39,884 Jews and 4 Jewish organizations remained in Vienna, and just 100 Jews and 2 religious communities remained in the other provinces. The Nazis' forced immigration policy had reduced the total Austrian Jewish population to just 39,984 people. Perhaps one of the saddest displays in this part of the museum is this one. In May of 1939, 936 passengers set sail from Hamburg for Cuba aboard the Hamburg America Lines ship called the St. Louis. All but 6 were Jews, some of the thousands seeking to leave Germany after the night of broken glass. Holding Cuban landing certificates, they seemed to be among the lucky ones. Yet, when the ship reached Havana, the Cuban authorities refused to let them disembark. Unbeknownst to the passengers and the ship's captain, the Cuban president, pressured by officials, had invalidated the refugees' landing certificates before they even left Germany. As the St. Louis remained in the Havana harbor, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a relief organization, initiated negotiations with the Cuban authorities and offered to post a $500 bond per passenger, but the Cubans rejected this proposal. Without assurance of a haven, the St. Louis left Cuba. Sailing close to the Florida shore, passengers could see the lights of Miami. U.S. Coast Guard ships patrolling the water ensured that no one jumped to freedom. The German captain, Gustav Schroeder, appealed in vain to the United States for permission to dock. The St. Louis headed back to Europe. Belgium, the Netherlands, Britain, and France each accepted refugees, but hundreds of them were killed later during the Holocaust. Newspapers and radio covered the plight of the passengers aboard the St. Louis. A New York Times editorial expressed hope that hearts would soften and some refuge would be found. The cruise of the St. Louis cries to high heaven of man's inhumanity to man. Urgent appeals to the U.S. State Department that the refugees be allowed to enter the United States were rejected. The passengers sent a desperate telegram to President Roosevelt, but their request for asylum went unanswered. During the 1930s and 40s, many of Europe's finest artists, writers, musicians, scholars, and scientists became refugees. Threatened because they were Jews or because their work was unacceptable to the Nazis, they sought safety in exile. Though many countries were reluctant to take in ordinary Jewish refugees, a few willingly accepted renowned Jewish artists and intellectuals. In the United States, the Emergency Visitors Visa Program was established to save persons of exceptional merit and those of superior intellectual attainment. The Emergency Rescue Committee, a private organization, sent a young editor, Varian Fry, to Europe in 1940 to help émigrés escape the Nazis. Fry enabled nearly 2,000 people to flee. The exiled playwright Bertolt Brecht reflected, "I know, of course, it's simply luck that I've survived so many friends. But last night in a dream I heard all those friends say of me, survival of the fittest, and I hated myself." At risk because of their politics and publications, the German authors Thomas Mann and Heinrich Mann and the theologian Paul Tillich left Germany in 1933. The Jewish writer Feuchtwanger emigrated to America. The novelist Arnold Zweig and Max Brod, the biographer of Franz Kafka, departed for Palestine. Albert Einstein left in 1933, settling in Princeton, New Jersey. Franz Werfel, the author of a novel about the Armenian genocide, also emigrated to the United States. As the territory of Nazi Germany expanded, the number of thinkers and writers seeking asylum grew. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, left for England, as did the author Stefan Zweig. The exodus of European artists included Jean Arp, Max Beckmann, André Breton, Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, George Grosz, Jacques Lipchitz, and André Masson. European society and culture suffered from the loss of so many intellectuals and artists. Cultural life in the United States and Great Britain benefited enormously from the immigration of these and so many other luminaries. In 1939, emboldened by his easy acquisition of Austria and Czechoslovakia, Hitler turned his attention to Poland and the free city of Danzig. Because France and Britain had promised to defend Poland in case of attack, German aggression could provoke a major European war. At this time, Hitler wanted above all else to avoid a war with simultaneous fronts in the East and the West. Before invading Poland, he used diplomatic means to secure the Eastern Front. The German Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, negotiated a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, that was signed on August 23rd. A secret appendix to the treaty sealed Poland's fate. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Poland up between them. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish frontier. The Poles fought bravely, but their defenses collapsed before the German onslaught. On September 17th, Soviet divisions invaded Poland from the east. By the end of the month, all of Poland was under German or Soviet occupation. Although France and Britain had declared war on Germany within 2 days of the German invasion, they failed to come to Poland's aid in time. Following the invasion of Poland, the Nazis unleashed a brutal campaign of terror against the population. Tens of thousands of Polish citizens were killed or sent to concentration camps and prisons in order to deprive the nation of its political and intellectual leaders and destroy resistance. The country was dismembered, and the Nazis quickly implemented their radical policies. German authorities began to expel Poles and Jews from the areas incorporated into the Reich and resettle ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union and the Baltic states there. By late 1940, more than 300,000 people had been forcibly evicted from their homes and transported to the general government, the German-administered territory of Poland not annexed to the Reich. The Nazis considered the Poles to be racially inferior and useful only as labor for the Reich. By mid-1940, some 700,000 Poles had been conscripted to work in Germany, where they were also subjected to discriminatory laws. The Nazis imposed severe educational limitations on the Polish populace to create a reservoir of manual laborers and to prevent the reemergence of a national leadership and culture. In a top-secret memorandum of May 25, 1940, SS leader Heinrich Himmler advised, "For the non-German population of the East, there must be no school higher than the 4th grade of elementary school. The sole goal of this schooling is to teach them simple arithmetic, writing one's name, and the doctrine that it is divine law to obey the Germans. I do not think that reading is desirable." Guided by such goals, the Nazis closed Polish universities and many secondary schools and killed or imprisoned thousands of teachers, professors, and priests. This tree stump marked the site of a mass grave near the Polish village of Palmary. German security police executed some 1,700 civilians here. Between 1939 and 1940, Nazi authorities in occupied Poland waged a brutal campaign against the country's intelligence and suspected resistance members. This photograph was taken shortly before these SS men killed their blindfolded captives. Here, Hitler is being briefed near the newly constructed fortifications in Western Germany. With him are the construction coordinator, Fritz Todt, Nazi Party Secretary, Martin Bormann, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, and Chief of Staff for Military Administration Wilhelm Keitel. World War II began on September 1, 1939, when a massive German force invaded Poland. Poland was defeated within 1 month. In April of 1940, Germany invaded and occupied Denmark and Norway. In May, the German army began its offensive against the Low Countries and France. The Netherlands surrendered on May 15th and Belgium on May 28th. British troops were forced to evacuate the continent, escaping via Dunkirk across the English Channel. Paris fell on June 10th, and on June 22nd, France surrendered. Germany occupied its northern half. The southern half remained under French control, administered by a collaborationist government at Vichy. Between July and October 1940, the German Air Force relentlessly bombed England. The Germans planned to invade Britain, but they met with unexpectedly strong resistance from the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain raged for 4 months. Germany lost 1,722 airplanes, and the RAF lost 915. Germany postponed their invasion, which ultimately never took place. During the winter of 1940, Germany finalized plans to invade the Soviet Union in mid-May of 1941. Instead, because of the military failures of its ally Italy in Albania, Germany invaded the Balkans on April 6th. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not launched until June 22nd, a delay that was to prove catastrophic to German warplanes. From the beginning of World War II, the German army had been victorious in every land campaign. On the eve of its attack on the Soviet Union, Germany seemed invincible. The Nazis targeted people with disabilities for systemic mass murder. The regime considered them to be a genetic threat and an economic burden. Resources, the Nazis believed, were better allocated to healthy Germans. In spring of 1939, they planned a secret operation to kill children with disabilities. That fall, Hitler authorized Operation T4, which extended the program to adults. Victims of the program were patients living in care facilities in Germany and in German-annexed lands. They had conditions such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, and intellectual or physical disabilities. Cooperation from doctors, nurses, and hospital directors was critical to the program. Medical personnel took part in nearly all aspects of it. Their roles ranged from planning and victim selection to outright murder. Staff killed patients by gassing, lethal overdose, or starvation. The Nazis referred to the death as euthanasia or mercy killing. In 1941, public discovery of the killings led to protests by a number of church leaders, judges, and citizens. Hitler issued a halt order to the adult program in late August. The killings secretly resumed in 1942 and continued until the war ended in 1945. An estimated 250,000 people died in the euthanasia program. As we leave this powerful exhibit behind, I'm reminded that the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words, ideas, laws, and silence. The years between 1933 and 1939 were marked not only by the Nazis' rise to power, but by the world's gradual descent into darkness. Every restriction, every humiliation, every act of violence was a warning sign, many of which went unanswered. This chapter of history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about perpetrators, but about bystanders and the cost of indifference. Walking through this exhibit, we witnessed not just the machinery of hate, but the lives it sought to erase. The next exhibit in the Holocaust Memorial Museum on the 3rd floor is about the United States. I've released that video as a second video today if you're interested in checking it out. We will explore a little more what the media was telling Americans and how Americans reacted to what was happening in Eastern Europe. This should be more than a history lesson. It should be a call to vigilance, to empathy, and to moral courage in the face of injustice, wherever and whenever it arises. I feel a little awkward even offering a postcard from a video as deep as this one, but I decided to visit the museum's gift shop to make a donation, and I ended up buying a pack of postcards in addition to making the donation because I just wanted to give them even more support. If you would like to receive this postcard, I will happily send it with a handwritten note to the first person to comment on this video asking for it. Thank you for joining me today. If this video spoke to you, I hope you will consider going to the Holocaust Memorial Museum's website and making a donation, or perhaps giving a little to the Holocaust charity that speaks to you. And always remember to always remember. Remembering is a form of resistance, and forgetting is not an option.